Ethan Hawke stood at the edge of his land, his boots crunching softly on the gravel as he gazed out over the sprawling fields, his family's legacy stretching beyond the horizon. The golden hues of the setting sun bathed the land in warm light, casting long, serene shadows across the farm. The familiar sounds of his livestock and the soft, rustling of leaves in the evening breeze brought a sense of peace, but Ethan's mind was far from calm. He could feel it, the tension that hung in the air, thick and unspoken, like a storm waiting to break. His fingers gripped the worn leather of the fence post, his thoughts drifting back to the past. Inheriting the farm from his grandfather had been both a blessing and a burden. He had worked tirelessly to preserve the land and its history. But then Karen Miller, the HOA president, came into the picture. For years, she had tried to impose her will on him and his property, her presence a constant source of stress. He had fought back each time, but it always felt like a battle he could never fully win. Now, as the sun dipped lower behind the hills, Ethan could sense the inevitable. She was coming for him again. The faint hum of tires on gravel broke his thoughts, and his pulse quickened. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The sound was too familiar. Karen's presence on his property had become a constant, like a shadow that never quite went away. He could feel it now, her relentless pursuit of control, always hovering at the edges of his life. The confrontation was coming, and he knew it. When Karen's car finally came into view, the familiar vehicle driving slowly down the dirt road, Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't have to move. Her arrival had become inevitable, a ritual of sorts, and this time, he was ready for it. As she stepped out of the car, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking on the gravel, Ethan's stomach tightened. Her expression was set, determined, and he could already tell this wasn't going to be the same as the others. "Ethan!" Karen called out, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. She was standing a few paces away now, her posture rigid, her eyes locked onto his with the same old disdain. "I'm afraid you're violating some rules again." Ethan's jaw tightened, a deep sigh escaping him. He had heard this 1,000 times before. But today there was something different, a coldness in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. This wasn't just about regulations. It wasn't just about the farm anymore. It was personal. "Karen," he replied, his voice calm but carrying an underlying frustration. "This farm is outside the jurisdiction of your HOA. You have no authority here." But Karen wasn't listening. Her eyes were already scanning the property, searching for something to criticize, something to latch onto. "This place is a mess," she sneered. "The animals are out of control. The property is filthy. And the smell, God, it's unbearable. You're a danger to this community. Ethan, you're breaking the HOA's regulations, and it's time you fixed this." Now, Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. He had been through this before. He had faced her threats time and time again. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about taking everything he had built. His peace, his family's legacy. And that was something he wouldn't allow her to take. "I've heard it all before, Karen," Ethan said, his voice tight with control. "And every time you've been wrong. This farm is my property. You don't get to tell me what to do with it." Karen's lips curled into a cold smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't need to tell you anything, Ethan," she said with a bitter laugh. "I've already called the authorities, the health department, animal control. They'll be here soon enough to deal with this." A chill ran through Ethan. This wasn't just another complaint. This was escalation, and he could see it in her eyes. She was playing a bigger game now. She wasn't just after the farm. She was after control, power. Ethan forced himself to steady his breath. He couldn't show any weakness. Not now. Not after all he had fought for. "You don't scare me, Karen," he said, his voice low and steady. "This farm is mine, and I'm not going to let you take it from me." Karen didn't flinch. "We'll see about that," she said, her tone final. With one last cold glance, she turned and walked back to her car. Ethan stood there, watching her retreat, his heart pounding in his chest. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Karen's car disappeared down the road, Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed the number he knew would change everything. "Mike," he said once the line connected. "It's happening again. She's called the authorities. I need your help." His uncle's calm, firm voice answered. "I'm on my way." "Stay put," Ethan exhaled, a sense of relief washing over him. The storm was coming, but this time he was ready. Ethan stood motionless, the evening breeze tugging at the hem of his shirt as he watched Karen's car fade into the distance. The soft rustle of the trees and the distant hum of insects were the only sounds that filled the space around him. But even those seemed far away. His mind raced with the familiar anxiety that came with every encounter with her. He had dealt with her manipulation before, but this time it felt different. The fear that had once seemed distant now hovered close, pressing down on him with every thought. With his hands braced on the fence, Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The air around him was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. The farm, the land that had been in his family for generations, was under threat again. And this time, it wasn't just about the property. It was about his family's legacy, the very thing Karen had tried to strip away with every complaint and rule she'd thrown at him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his thoughts. The number on the screen was familiar. He didn't need to look at it twice. It was Mike, his uncle, the one person who had always had his back when things went south. "Mike," Ethan said, his voice steady, though there was an edge to it that he couldn't hide. "I know what's going on," Mike said, cutting straight to the point. "I'm on my way." Ethan nodded, even though Mike couldn't see him. The words, "I'm on my way," brought a sliver of relief, but it didn't fully calm the storm inside. His uncle's presence would help, but Ethan knew that Karen's reach extended far beyond just the local HOA. This battle was bigger than just a few zoning complaints. It was a war over his family's future. The minutes dragged on as he waited for Mike to arrive. Each second felt like an hour. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. Karen had been ruthless before, but this time, there was an intensity to her that made the air feel thicker. She wasn't just fighting for control of his farm. This time, she was fighting to destroy it. Ethan glanced down the road, scanning for any sign of his uncle's arrival. He could feel his heart beating faster with each passing minute. The silence of the land around him only amplified the growing tension inside. The distant sounds of the farm, the bleating of the sheep, the clucking of chickens, felt like distant echoes, as though they were trying to break through the weight pressing down on his chest. Then, the familiar rumble of a car engine broke the silence. Ethan didn't move as the headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. He knew it was Mike. When the patrol car pulled up, Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, though it didn't fully erase the knot of anxiety in his stomach. The door creaked open, and Mike stepped out, his weathered face appearing in the dim light. Even in the darkness, there was no mistaking the authority in his presence. He was here, and that meant something. "Mike," Ethan said, his voice tight with frustration. "It's worse than I thought." Mike's eyes sharpened as he looked Ethan over, sensing the weight of the situation. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice calm but laced with concern. Ethan quickly relayed the events that had led to this moment. Karen's complaints, the authorities she had involved, and the growing sense of dread he felt in his gut. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of the words pressing down on him, each one making the situation feel more real, more urgent. Mike stayed quiet for a moment, taking it all in. His gaze was unwavering as he processed the information. Finally he spoke, his tone steady but filled with a sense of grim certainty. "Karen's always been a problem, Ethan. But this time, she's playing a much bigger game. She's gone too far." Ethan nodded, his chest tight with anxiety. "I know, I can feel it. This isn't just about the farm anymore. It's about something else. She's trying to break me." Mike's gaze hardened. "She's good at playing the system, Ethan. She knows how to manipulate people, how to get what she wants. But she won't win this time. Not as long as I'm here." Ethan swallowed, trying to steady himself. His uncle's words offered some comfort, but they couldn't fully ease the weight pressing down on him. This wasn't just a fight over land. It was a battle for his future, for the future of everything his family had worked for. And Karen's game was far from over. As they stood in silence, the sound of approaching cars in the distance brought a new wave of tension. The authorities were here, just as Karen had promised. This was it. The confrontation Ethan had been dreading was finally about to unfold. Mike turned to face him, his voice sharp but calm. "Let's see what happens next, Ethan. Just stay calm. We'll handle this." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. As the vehicles rolled to a stop, he felt the weight of everything he stood to lose settle over him. The battle for his family's farm was just beginning. The night air grew colder as Ethan stood on his porch, watching the headlights of the approaching vehicles slice through the darkness. He felt the weight of every minute, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. His heart raced as the sound of tires crunching on gravel became louder, each second drawing him closer to the confrontation he had known was coming. Mike had arrived, but that didn't mean the battle was over. It was only just beginning. As the patrol car slowed to a stop, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. His uncle, Sheriff Mike, was here, his unwavering ally in the face of Karen's relentless crusade. The door of the car opened, and Mike's towering figure emerged, cutting through the shadows. His face, weathered by years of service, revealed a calm resolve. But there was no mistaking the fire in his eyes. Mike was ready for this, just as Ethan was. Ethan stepped forward, his breath misting in the cold night air. "Mike," he called, his voice steady but tinged with tension. "It's worse than I thought." Mike's gaze locked onto Ethan's, his expression sharpening. "Tell me everything," he said, his tone firm. But there was a trace of concern in his eyes. He knew how hard this had been for Ethan, how much was at stake. Ethan quickly filled Mike in on the latest developments, the authorities Karen had called, the accusations that had been thrown at his farm, and the undercurrent of fear that had begun to seep into his bones. The words came fast, the weight of each one pressing him down further. This wasn't just another complaint. It was an all-out assault on everything he had built. When he finished, Mike remained silent for a moment, his mind processing what had just been said. Ethan could see the wheels turning behind his uncle's eyes, the careful calculation that came with years of experience in law enforcement. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice low and measured, but full of quiet intensity. "Karen's been a problem for a long time, Ethan, but this is different. She's making her move." Ethan swallowed hard, the knot in his stomach tightening. "I feel it, Mike. She's not just trying to control the farm anymore. This is personal. And she won't stop until she's taken everything." Mike's gaze hardened. "She won't succeed. Not as long as I'm here to back you up." Ethan nodded, though the storm brewing inside him refused to ease. He knew his uncle's words were meant to comfort him, but they didn't quite have the same effect they usually did. This wasn't just about standing his ground anymore. It was about fighting for his legacy, for his family's future, and for everything he had worked to protect. The minutes stretched on, the distant sounds of crickets and rustling, leaves becoming a background. As Ethan's mind raced. What would happen when the authorities arrived? Would they believe Karen's lies, or would they see the truth? What would it cost him to defend his home? As if on cue, headlights appeared on the horizon again. This time, it wasn't just Mike. The authorities had arrived, their official vehicles parked neatly along the side of the road. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment he had been dreading had arrived. He was no longer just standing up to Karen's petty complaints. This was real. This was a fight for his farm. Mike gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder as he took a step forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Stay close. Let them do their job." Ethan stood still, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the group of officials as they approached. The tension in the air was palpable, every second stretching out as if time itself was testing him. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the authority they wielded like a weapon. Every inch of the land felt like it was under a microscope, the slightest detail scrutinized for any possible flaw. Karen stepped out of her car, heels clicking sharply on the gravel as she walked toward the group. Her expression was cold, smug even, like she already knew she had won. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Her confidence in the situation sent a wave of unease crashing through him. She had been so sure, so calculated. This was her victory in her mind. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The officials spread out across the farm, their eyes cold and detached as they inspected every corner, every building, every fence post. Ethan could feel their judgment, like an invisible weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He wanted to step in, to tell them the truth, but he knew better than to get in their way. Minutes dragged on like hours. Ethan could hear the faint murmur of voices, the officials discussing among themselves. Every word they spoke felt like a hammer to his chest. Then finally, the man in the suit, the one who appeared to be in charge, turned to the group and gave his verdict. "There are no violations here," he said, his voice firm and authoritative. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, the relief hitting him in waves. His heart slowed, the tightness in his chest loosening. Though the tension didn't completely dissipate, Karen's smug expression faltered for just a moment, but she quickly masked it with a scowl. "This can't be right," Karen snapped, her voice rising in frustration. "You can't just ignore the complaints. The animals are—" "The farm is compliant," the official interrupted, his tone cutting through her words. "There are no issues here. You're free to go." Ethan watched Karen, her lips curling into a snarl as she realized she had lost. There was no fight left in her. Slowly, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking louder than ever, each step a bitter reminder of her failure. Mike clapped Ethan on the back, his grin wide. "Looks like the truth won out, huh?" Ethan exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "It's over, for now," he said, watching Karen disappear into the night. "But I know she won't give up." Mike nodded, his expression turning serious. "No, she won't. But this time, you're not alone." Ethan watched the horizon, the weight of everything still heavy on his chest. The fight wasn't over, but for tonight, he had won. The night stretched on, an eerie silence falling over the land. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to him. The confrontation with the authorities had ended, but his mind was still racing. The uncertainty of what would come next weighed heavily on him. His farm, his legacy, had been scrutinized, his resolve tested. The feeling of victory was bittersweet. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ethan's eyes darted to the horizon once more. The last traces of daylight had long faded, and the cold of the night crept in. He stood at the edge of the field, his boots firm against the soil, grounding him to the land that had been his family's for generations. But as he stood there, his thoughts swirled, consumed by the looming threat of Karen's next move. He knew she wouldn't back down. People like her didn't know how to lose. They only learned how to fight harder. A faint sound reached his ears, the distant hum of an approaching engine. His body tensed instinctively. He didn't need to look. He could feel her presence before he even saw her. Karen. The confrontation had only been a temporary lull in the storm. Ethan turned, his heart thudding in his chest. The headlights of her car cut through the darkened road, bringing with them a sense of inevitability. He could already feel the tension in the air, thickening as she drew closer. The car came to a slow halt, and Karen stepped out. This time, she wasn't the woman who had stormed onto his property, with accusations and complaints. There was something different about her. Gone was the smug confidence she had worn like armor. Her steps were slower, less forceful. The fire that had once burned so brightly in her eyes had dimmed, replaced with something far colder, a sense of resignation. Ethan noticed it immediately. "You've got a lot of nerve," Ethan said, his voice calm. Though his body was tense, he wasn't surprised to see her. But something about this moment felt different. The quiet stillness between them felt charged, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Karen stood a few paces away from him, her eyes scanning the land around them. Her shoulders were slumped, and for the first time, she didn't seem like the domineering figure she had always been. There was a palpable weariness to her, as though the weight of everything she had done was finally catching up to her. "I never wanted things to go this far, Ethan," she said, her voice softer than usual, almost fragile. The words were unexpected, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan found himself caught off guard. This wasn't the woman who had relentlessly sought to tear down his farm, the woman who had tried to destroy everything he had built. This was someone different, a woman who, for a moment, seemed like she might have realized the cost of her actions. Ethan remained silent, watching her carefully. He had fought tooth and nail to protect his family's legacy, to preserve everything his grandfather had worked for. But Karen's words gave him pause. Could it be that she was finally realizing the truth? That she had been blinded by her own need for control? "I thought I was doing what was right," Karen continued, her gaze now distant. "I thought I was protecting the community. But I see now that I was wrong." Ethan could hear the remorse in her voice, but he wasn't sure he was ready to forgive her. Not after everything she had done. "It's too late for apologies," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You've caused too much damage, Karen. Too many lives have been affected by your need to control." There was a long pause between them. Ethan watched as Karen processed his words, her face crumpling with a mix of regret and resignation. She had been so sure of herself for so long, convinced that her way was the only way. But now, in the quiet of the night, it seemed as though she was starting to see things differently. "I never meant for things to get so out of hand," Karen whispered, her eyes flickering with what Ethan could only describe as vulnerability. It was a side of her he had never seen before. One that didn't feel like the woman who had been so intent on tearing down his world. This Karen, the one standing before him, seemed broken. Ethan's grip on the fence loosened. He hadn't expected this. He had been ready for another round of accusations, another attack on his farm. But now, as he stood there facing Karen, the weight of the moment settled on him. This wasn't the confrontation he had imagined. The air between them had shifted, and he could feel the finality of it. The anger he had once harbored seemed to dissipate, replaced with something more complex. Understanding, perhaps, or even pity. Karen's voice broke through his thoughts. "I'll leave," she said, her words soft and tinged with sorrow. "I won't come back. I've caused enough pain." For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. He simply watched her, unsure of what to say. Karen, the woman who had been his fiercest adversary, was walking away. The power dynamic between them had shifted. And for the first time, Ethan felt a sense of closure. As Karen turned and walked away, her figure shrinking into the darkness, Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight lifting off his shoulders. It wasn't the victory he had imagined, but it was a victory nonetheless. The farm was still his, and for tonight, that was enough. The following days were filled with an unsettling stillness. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that, even after everything that had happened, the storm was far from over. The farm, his sanctuary, had always been more than just land. It was a connection to his grandfather, a living legacy. But with Karen's relentless tactics and her manipulation now a fading memory, Ethan felt like a weight had been lifted. Still, something gnawed at him deep inside. The calm felt fragile, and he couldn't help but wonder when the next blow would fall. The sun had set, leaving the sky painted with streaks of purple and orange, the last vestiges of light fading behind the trees. Ethan stood at the edge of the field, watching as the shadows stretched over the land, the rustle of the wind, and the distant chirp of crickets, the only sounds breaking the silence. The quiet was comforting, but it also carried a sense of tension he couldn't ignore. His thoughts wandered back to Karen. He couldn't shake the image of her, standing before him, looking so different, broken, vulnerable, her pride shattered. He had never expected her to back down, yet, in the end, it was her own arrogance and need for control that had driven her away. There was no victory in watching her retreat, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing she no longer had the power to destroy what he had built. Ethan had expected more from her. The confrontation had been nothing like he had imagined. Karen's resignation had been sudden, almost out of nowhere. For the first time, she had admitted her faults, her role in tearing apart the community. But her departure had left him with mixed emotions. He couldn't forget the damage she had done, the people she had manipulated. In the end, she was just as much a victim of her own power-hungry nature as anyone she had hurt. As Ethan stood there, lost in thought, the sound of tires crunching against the gravel road broke his reverie. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to see the headlights to know who it was. He had been expecting this, the unmistakable presence of someone who wouldn't simply fade into the background. Ethan braced himself, his muscles tensing in anticipation. The car pulled into the driveway, its engine cutting off with an abrupt silence. Ethan stayed where he was, unmoving. The door creaked open, and a familiar figure stepped out. For a moment, he wasn't sure what to expect. Was this another attempt at manipulation? A final showdown? Or was it something different? Karen stood there, her posture rigid but not as self-assured as before. She looked worn, smaller somehow, like someone who had been through a battle she couldn't win. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was no animosity, just the barest trace of something he couldn't quite place. "I didn't expect to see you again," Ethan said, his voice guarded but calm. "I thought you'd learned your lesson." Karen shifted uneasily, her gaze dropping to the ground for a moment. She had always been so confident, so certain of her power. But now, in front of him, she seemed different. There was no defiance, no fire in her eyes. Instead, she seemed lost, like she was trying to find something, but couldn't. "I didn't come here to fight, Ethan," she said, her voice quieter than usual. The usual venom in her tone had been replaced with something else. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. Ethan didn't respond immediately. His eyes studied her, trying to decipher the woman who had once tried to destroy him, his farm, and everything he stood for. Had she truly changed? Was this just another ploy? He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. She wasn't the same Karen he had faced before. "I made mistakes," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I thought I was doing what was best for everyone, but I was wrong. I let my need for control take over. I hurt people in the process, including you." Ethan's grip on the fence tightened, but he didn't speak. His mind raced. Could it be true? Had Karen really changed? He wanted to believe it, but the scars of everything she had done were too fresh. "You were trying to control everything," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You didn't just want to protect the community. You wanted to own it, and in doing so, you nearly destroyed everything that mattered." Karen nodded slowly, her head hanging in shame. "I know, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never thought it would get this far. But I can't keep doing this. I can't keep hurting people just to feel in control." For the first time, Ethan saw something real in her eyes, something that wasn't just about power or manipulation. There was vulnerability there, a recognition of the damage she had caused, and it was that recognition that made Ethan's heart ache. "I've done enough damage," Karen said almost to herself. "I'll leave. I won't come back. But I can't undo what's been done." Ethan stood still, his chest tightening. He had expected anger, bitterness, a final fight. But this was unexpected. This was a person who had finally seen the consequences of her actions. "It's too late for apologies, Karen," he said quietly, his voice softer than he had intended. "But you're right about one thing. It's over." With a final look at him, Karen turned and walked away, her footsteps slow and heavy. Ethan watched her leave, a mix of emotions flooding him. Relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. This wasn't a victory that felt like a triumph. There was no celebration, no sense of winning. It was simply the end of a long battle. As Karen's figure disappeared into the night, Ethan allowed himself a breath. It was over. But the scars would remain. The farm was still his, but the cost of keeping it had been higher than he had ever imagined. The days following Karen's departure passed with an eerie calm. But Ethan couldn't quite shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. The battle had been long, and though it seemed like the neighborhood had found peace, he knew Karen's departure wasn't the end of the war. No, this was just another chapter in a saga that had shaped his life for years. His farm, his sanctuary, was still standing, but the weight of the struggle hung over him like a cloud. Every time he stepped outside, he could feel the presence of the land beneath his boots, the place that had belonged to his grandfather, a legacy he had fought so hard to preserve. And yet, every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, his heart ached with the realization that peace was only temporary. Karen had shown just how far she would go to control what didn't belong to her. The evening air was colder now, a subtle reminder of the passing seasons. The chill settled in his bones as he walked the fields, boots crunching against the gravel as the wind whispered through the trees. His thoughts were heavy, weighed down by memories of the past few weeks. Despite Karen's apparent defeat, the scars of the battle lingered on his farm, in his heart, and in the community around him. He wasn't naive enough to think that Karen would simply walk away. People like her didn't give up easily. As the darkness deepened, a familiar sound reached Ethan's ears, the hum of a car engine in the distance. His stomach tightened. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Karen was back. The thought of facing her again stirred a mixture of anger and dread in his chest. She hadn't left for good. He had known this day would come. The headlights broke through the darkness, illuminating the winding road that led to his farm. Ethan stood still, the weight of the moment settling on him like a heavy cloak. He had been preparing for this, mentally steeling himself for whatever Karen had in store this time. The last time they had spoken, there had been something almost remorseful in her voice, a flicker of vulnerability he had never expected. But he couldn't forget the damage she had done. He couldn't forget the years of threats, manipulation, and lies. The car pulled to a stop, and Karen stepped out, her silhouette barely visible against the fading light. This time her movements were slow, deliberate. There was no forceful stride, no aggressive posture. She stood there, just outside the reach of the light, as if waiting for something, perhaps for Ethan to make the first move. Ethan didn't approach. He didn't need to. He had already fought for this land, and he wasn't about to back down now. As she walked toward him, he could see it. The same coldness in her eyes. But there was something else, too. Something that didn't belong. A weariness that wasn't there before. "Ethan," she said, her voice softer than usual, but still laced with authority. "I need to talk to you." "About what?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, though a knot tightened in his stomach. What could possibly be left to say? Karen hesitated, then took a step closer. "I've made mistakes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I let my need for control blind me, and in doing so I hurt people. I hurt you." The words were unexpected. Ethan studied her carefully, searching for any trace of deception. But this time, there was no anger in her eyes, no malicious intent. Instead, there was something that resembled regret. For a moment, he was tempted to believe her. But then, the reality of everything she had done hit him again. The lies, the manipulations, the countless battles that had drained him, both physically and emotionally. "You've caused a lot of damage, Karen," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the bitterness that rose in his chest. "You've torn this community apart, all because you wanted control." "I know," Karen said, her voice breaking slightly. "I didn't realize how far I'd gone, how much I'd hurt everyone around me." Ethan's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He had fought so hard to protect what was his, to keep the farm safe from her grasp. But now, standing before him, Karen wasn't the same person who had terrorized him for so long. She was broken, vulnerable, and for the first time, he saw her not as an adversary, but as a woman who had lost her way. "I can't undo the past," Karen continued, her eyes downcast. "But I'm done fighting. I'll leave. I'll get out of your life for good." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan didn't know what to say. Could he forgive her? Could he let go of the anger that had fueled him for so long? The battle had been long and hard, but now, with the weight of her apology hanging in the air, he didn't feel victorious. He just felt exhausted. "Goodbye, Ethan," Karen said, her voice barely audible. And without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps heavy with finality. Ethan watched her disappear into the night, his chest tight. It was over. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an ending. A long, drawn-out ending to a battle that had cost him more than he had ever imagined. As the sound of her car faded into the distance, Ethan allowed himself a breath. The farm was still his, but the price of keeping it had been steep, and as he turned back toward the land, he knew one thing for certain. The scars of this war would never truly heal. Ethan's life had settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm after Karen's departure. There was a quiet peace on the farm now, but the weight of everything he had fought for still pressed on his chest. The calm felt more like the eye of a storm, and Ethan knew that as much as he longed for rest, the storm wasn't done with him. Karen's last words lingered in his mind, echoing in the silence that followed. She had said she was done, but Ethan knew better. People like Karen didn't truly let go. The days passed with a heavy air that seemed to hang over the fields, the once familiar landscape now bathed in the haunting light of a new reality. His farm, his sanctuary, had always been more than just land. It was his family's legacy, the very foundation of everything he held dear. But after years of constant tension, of fighting against someone who seemed to know no boundaries, he couldn't shake the feeling that something would come again, just when he least expected it. Ethan walked across the property, boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way to the barn. The wind whispered through the trees, but his thoughts were too loud for him to find peace in the sound of nature. He knew that no matter how far he tried to push it away, the specter of Karen's manipulations still loomed. There was no forgetting the way she had twisted the rules of the neighborhood to suit her whims. No one was safe from her reach. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the farm in long shadows, Ethan's heart began to race, the stillness of the evening making the sound of tires on gravel seem louder, sharper. He turned, already knowing who it was. A part of him had expected this, the return of a familiar battle. Another chapter in the long story of his struggle for peace. It didn't matter that she had left. He felt it in his bones. Karen was coming back. Her headlights cut through the darkness, announcing her arrival long before her car reached the driveway. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the approaching vehicle. He hadn't moved when she stopped, didn't flinch when the door opened, and Karen stepped out. This time, she wasn't the same forceful presence that had arrived many times before. Her steps were slower, more deliberate, and as she made her way towards him, Ethan couldn't help but notice the weariness in her movements, the slight slump of her shoulders. She didn't speak immediately. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. When she did finally open her mouth, her voice lacked the usual bite, the sharpness that had always left him feeling cornered. Instead, it was almost tentative. "Ethan?" she said, her voice softer than before, though still tinged with authority. "We need to talk." "About what this time?" Ethan's words came out steady, but his pulse quickened. There was a hint of dread in the air, a reminder that she hadn't truly disappeared. "What could you possibly want now?" Karen's gaze softened slightly, but her lips remained tight. She stood just a few feet away, her eyes searching his face. "I know I've done things wrong," she said, her voice low, almost apologetic. "I pushed too hard, tried to control everything. But Ethan, I'm done. I don't want to fight anymore." Ethan stared at her, his chest tightening as he processed her words. He had never expected this. Not from her. He had always known Karen as the relentless force who fought for control, who wouldn't back down, no matter what the cost. But now, standing in front of him, she seemed different. The anger that had once burned so brightly in her eyes was gone, replaced by something he couldn't quite identify. "You don't get it," Ethan finally said, his voice strained with exhaustion. "You've already done the damage. I can't just forget everything. You've manipulated, lied, tried to break me, tried to break my family's legacy. And now you think you can just walk away like it never happened?" Karen's face twisted in something close to regret. "I never meant for it to go this far. But I've realized that my need for control, it was wrong. I hurt people along the way, and I can't undo that." She paused, then added quietly, "Especially not to you." Ethan's mind raced. Could he forgive her? Could he let go of the resentment that had built up over the years? She had tried to destroy everything he loved, And now she stood here, asking for forgiveness. It was too much to process all at once. "There's no undoing it," Ethan said, his voice almost a whisper. "The damage is done. And I can't just pretend it didn't happen." Karen nodded slowly, accepting his words. "I understand. I had to say it. I had to admit it to myself. I was wrong, Ethan." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their history hung heavily between them, a gap that could never truly be closed. Finally, Karen turned to leave, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She didn't look back this time, and Ethan didn't stop her. It was over. As she disappeared into the night, Ethan stood frozen, his mind still reeling. The weight that had settled in his chest felt different now. It wasn't the victory he had imagined. There was no elation, no sense of triumph, only the quiet aftermath of a long and exhausting battle. The farm was still his, but the cost had been high. The scars of this war would never fully fade.